Hello, welcome to AT&T Threat Track for April 5th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined online by Jim Clausing. Welcome back, Jim.
Hey, how's it going out there?
Good. And I think we're going to see you soon here in New Jersey, so looking forward to that. Also on the couch, we have Matt Kaiser. Welcome back, Matt.
Glad to be here.
All right, thanks. And I'm John Hogaboom. And let's jump right into the stories we have for this week, because there's some interesting ones. And the first one that you were going to talk about, Matt, is there's some vaccines. We were talking about ransomware last week, I know. And it sounds like there's some vaccines for a few families of ransomware.
Yeah, you
Maybe you
say
could
that.
describe what this story is about.
Maybe I should put vaccines in quotes.
Yes.
But a French anti-malware group, Lexi, has been doing some analysis of the Locky ransomware, which has been making its rounds pretty prevalent today, and created a tool that makes very minor system modifications to prevent Locky from behaving properly. Now, the first thing that they suggest in this article is if you want to avoid Locky altogether, change your system language to Russian. Because
Interesting.
absolutely, that will prevent Locky from running on your machine. That's in the code.
Probably be difficult to pick up Russian that quickly.
And that is the reason why they move on to other indicators immediately. Although the Russian-speaking population, if you can swing it, go for it.
So they intentionally did something there. I guess the creators of Locky specifically coded it and said if it's Russian language, that don't
run.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So there's a couple things that they mention in this article which are kind of neat little tricks, things that they found in the logic of Locky that if you set values before they're supposed to be set or you modify them a little bit, it won't behave right. So you can prevent it from writing from its usual registry keys. You can set ones that Locky uses to make it think it's already done its job.
Interesting.
You can corrupt one of the crypto keys that it stores so that the encryption portion of it fails completely and nothing gets encrypted. You can force the use of a known RSA crypto key, so even if it does run, you know exactly how to decrypt it.
Interesting.
Yeah. And those are the ones that I think they mostly focused on. Now, Bitdefender actually came out recently with their own tool set for Locky, CTB Locker, and TeslaCrypt, 3 different families. They're not saying which methods they used. I assume they might have made some use of some of these. I think the interesting part about this is as cool and as sort of nifty as it is to use these sorts of tricks, a lot of them are going to be invalidated in the next versions of these malware anyway. Because as soon as the malware authors catch wind of this, they're going to say, well, I'm going to make an end run around this. I'm going to change where this value gets stored or how this check gets performed, and it's all going to be for nothing. So I think I wanted to just ask you guys your opinion on whether or not you think this sort of research is valuable, or at least the amount of work you'd put into doing it, is it worth it for the amount of time it's actually going to work for you? Because you know you have maybe a couple of days before the next version comes out and everything is fixed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it always is a game of cat and mouse, right? You're always going to be catching up with each other. This is, to me, it's interesting because I hadn't really thought about this type of strategy of basically trying to find weaknesses in the malware of how it operates and then inoculating yourselves, quotes unquote, your machine. So maybe if I do have a large corporate network, I could apply these types of policies to all of my machines, and then if Locky did make its way to that machine, it wouldn't run. But as soon as the cat's out of the bag and like the story gets released, now the writers of Locky know that and they're going to code around these situations that people are already taking into account. So
it makes you wonder if there's a way to automate your half of the cat and mouse game. You get the new sample of Locky, you see what changes it makes, you try and rewrite your inoculation to.
Yeah,
you may have to do a lot more testing than that, but
there needs to be a human that's like looking at. I don't know if you can have a machine figure out as much of this without really maybe looking at how the code functions.
It's also true, though, that the malware authors, to some extent, are lazy, and if they'll use the same registry key, for example, for a long time, as their indicator of whether or not they've already infected this box until it ceases to work for them. So, this is the kind of thing that we do look for, when we're analyzing malware. What kind of registry keys does it access and why? As an indicator of compromise, well, then you can turn these around in many cases into inoculation. So it's research that's worth doing, whether or not it's worth the effort to deploy these, inoculations, that I have mixed feelings on. But
Yeah, I guess I would be concerned about now my machine, this is just one thing, but let's say down the line they tried to use this strategy more so going forward. And now I've got hundreds of just garbage random registry keys in my machine that really aren't functional, but they're there to kind of protect me from this or that malware family actually executing.
Well, to be fair, if you have a machine and you install and uninstall software all the time, chances are you've got a whole bunch of useless registry garbage in there anyway.
Yeah, that's a whole nother, but that's a whole different reason though.
I'm trying to think ahead on this one, and I think it may really depend, the usefulness of these tactics might really depend on the ecosystem around the malware author, whether or not they're selling it to third parties and how often they provide updates.
Right.
So if someone sold off, 1,000 copies of Locky, they're not expecting another update for another quarter, maybe you're going to be fine until the next patch comes out for Locky for another quarter.
Right. And that is a valid, when you talk about this, how long it's going to be effective, this inoculation or vaccine, is really the key thing. Because it's not a terrible strategy. It's kind of weird to me. But if the malware is so polymorphic that AV vendors can't figure out that this executable is malware when it arrives, and you're using these strategies to prevent the ransomware from executing, and that strategy will keep you safe for 3 to 4 months, that's not terrible. Because as we know, ransomware, when it gets on a machine, especially if it gets throughout your network, could be extremely problematic in terms of its impact on your environment. So
just thinking of how many different packed samples you'll see in a given day's campaign, if you can do this and get yourself a day's worth of quiet time or protection, maybe it is worth it. Who knows?
Right.
If you have the ability to push these sorts of inoculations out.
And you should be able to with some kind of group policy thing or whatnot. I don't really know all the different types of things that they had to do there, but certainly registry keys, you could do that. So interesting. Do you have something else, Jim, you were going to mention?
yeah, no, same thought. It's a question of how long it's good for. That would be where the trade-off would come.
Right. So it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this, but I find this, it's an interesting little study. I think we're all in agreement of that. Its effectiveness is maybe to be determined of how well it's going to be effective and whether the malware authors are going to adapt to it, quickly or not. Or like Jim said, maybe they're too lazy to even bother. If they get enough infected hosts, that might be all they care about, but it could be a strategy you want to think about. So the next story is one that you were looking at, Jim. There's a 0-day bypass in OS 10.
Yes, this one it was presented first at a conference in Singapore a week and a half ago or so. What I'd really like is to see the video, because I've looked at the slides and I think I have a fairly decent understanding of how it works. Essentially, what's happened here, in the latest version of Mac OS 10, the El Capitan 10.11, they introduced a feature called System Integrity Protection. And the idea with System Integrity Protection is it was supposed to protect you even if you had root access. There were certain things that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have, the additional permissions within this System Integrity Protection. What these guys have discovered is that there are actually some race conditions and some other programmatic ways of bypassing pieces of this SIP to the extent that you actually can get your elevated privileges and do whatever you want on the system, even with this System Integrity Protection enabled. The slides are kind of interesting. They show that one of the things that SIP is supposed to do is it's supposed to prevent you from being able to run a debugger against an executable that has these protections enabled. You can't attach to the running processes. But it turns out there actually are ways to debug it. So he was able to get in there and figure out what all was going on. But the key was a race condition in the kernel where we've got multiple processes trying to essentially access a certain portion of memory, and whoever gets there first wins. And if you are able to exploit this race condition, you can bypass the system integrity protection. No word yet. This has been reported to Apple. No word yet on when patches will be available for this. I believe that there were some Apple updates in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know if this was included in it. That's one thing I haven't had a chance since I was studying these slides to figure out if this is already patched or if the patch is going to be forthcoming.
Okay. Was there any, does anyone know if anybody's actually using this to actively exploit and distribute malware of any sort?
Not aware of any active exploitation of this at the moment, but it is stable, which is one of the key things about this. You run into a lot of privilege escalation or integrity protections that will cause programs to crash.
Right.
This one doesn't. Even if you don't manage to beat the other process in the race condition, it doesn't crash the process, which sometimes happens like this. It's extremely stable, and it is in parts of the OS that you're normally not looking for. Your anti-malware kinds of stuff isn't going to be looking in those directions most of the time. It looks like a really interesting exploit, and our producer tells me that it has in fact been patched. So it was included in that bunch of patches just a couple weeks ago. So that's a good thing. It should now be patched, but it's an interesting way of thinking about how the bad guys try to get around every new security protection we put in place. They're going to try to find a way around it.
Right. Well, that's what they do. And but I guess the moral of the story is, like you said, it sounds like there is a patch available now. So if you do have OS 10, you should make sure your systems are updated to account for this. Because it sounds like
10.11.4 is the patched version.
Okay, good. And it sounds like you said, it's a pretty reliable and stable exploit. So if you're not patched for it and people do start to use it, it sounds like it could be very successful in terms of its exploitation. So
yeah, now it would require somebody actually compromising the system another way. The user would have to fall victim to a phishing attack or drive-by or something, but it would require some other exploitation.
Right. Okay, yeah, but I mean, we see that all the time. Get a phishing email with some kind of attachment that has some executable or whatnot in it, and then next thing you know, game over. So, all right. So moving along, next story is one that you were looking at, Matt, and remote code execution of a different kind, this time in more IoT stuff, I guess it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So what do you know about this one?
So this comes to us from the Kerner on Sec blog. It's just a nice little write-up of an IoT bug. It originally came out of research, and I thought this was kind of cool, into the back-off point-of-sale Trojan. And apparently the actors behind those attacks were using CCTV devices as sort of a hot point. They'd compromise those first, and then they'd look around the network looking for point of sale that happened to be on the same. So you imagine like a small business network that has both a camera system for security and then point of sale accessible to each other on the same network. It makes sense to use that as your hot point into the network if you can get there from the outside.
Right, so the bad guy first gets in, looks at the DVR camera system, says, oh, look, they got a point of sale here that they're ringing people up on, and over here, I'm going to try to see if I could find those on the network, and then put the point of sale malware on those.
So good argument for network segmentation if you can do it. But anyway, back to the CCTV.
Right.
So the guy behind this blog, he mapped out a whole bunch of these DVRs using Shodan, everybody's favorite tool.
Oh, okay.
The web server calls itself Cross Web Server, which is pretty easy to search for on port 8000. And we started looking into the web interface, found out that it was, the one he was looking at particular was an Israeli brand, was actually, the hardware and firmware behind it was from China. Not
Okay.
too many surprises there. They found a remote code command injection bug by looking through the firmware, which is a pretty popular way of finding bugs
Right.
these days and kind of fun to do. And then he actually provides the the proof of concept. Getting POC and POS and all my acronyms in my head right now. But then he took a look at to see who else was, what other brands might be affected. And it turns out there are about 70, more than 70 different brands of DVR that are essentially the same product, white labeled.
Yeah, I've noticed that there is like this OEM stuff going on with these DVR security camera systems where it's like one manufacturer and then there's a whole bunch of vendors that kind of stamp their own label on it, but really the underlying stuff is the same essentially.
Yep. So the bug apparently affects all of them. So the one company behind all of it is apparently this TVT company out of China.
Okay.
The guy behind the blog, Kerner, he told them about the bug, waited, no response, and so he released it online. So I think the big question with this sort of a situation is when you've got 70 different companies and 70 different points of contact for customers, what do you do when you find a bug in the product? I mean, is TVT responsible for pushing patches to everybody who's white labeling their products? Is this something that each vendor is going to handle separately on their own? I mean, how do you go ahead and try and fix a bug like this? It seems like a pretty massive undertaking.
Yeah, and not only that, there probably, even if there was a patch that was made available, I'll venture to guess that the majority of these 70 different vendors don't have automatic updates on any of their software, and the people who have dumped them on their network or in their stores and whatnot probably have never touched it since the day they put it on the network, so it's never going to get the patch anyway. I'm being a little bit pessimistic
I was
here,
trying
but
to avoid that discussion mostly because I had taken that for a foregone conclusion. I was just thinking in a perfect world, or at least a moderately good one, how would we approach a problem this way? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I guess my assumption would be that TVT, right, who is the underlying software developer for that hardware, would probably try to make some patch available. And then those other vendors that are white labeling would have to integrate it into their product line. Because I bet you they've got extra stuff they put on top, or maybe skinned a new user interface or things like that. So they would have to integrate it with their software, and who knows if they're all going to do that.
You know what I just realized? This is a parallel to Android. We're talking about the Android problem all over again. But still,
similar kind of thing, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is, although I would venture. And then the other question is it the right thing to do to release this kind of information? And I'm not opposed to it, but the problem becomes it's probably not going to get patched well, based on the history we know about these types of devices, these IoT type devices. And even if, like I said, even if a patch becomes available, it's probably not going to get applied en masse to all the affected devices. So that just means there's going to be people out there who are going to use this technique to go exploit more of them, and we're going to see more scanning on port 23 TCP, like we talk about in the internet weather all the time,
in this
or
case,
other ports as well.
Port 8000.
So the problem's just going to keep going on. So hopefully, as time goes on, people are going to get smarter. I think last week you had talked about that book on the Internet of Things. Hopefully, people designing these systems and writing the software take note of what's going on in this space, read some of these books of different types of exploits, things you should consider when you're designing these types of systems, and pay closer attention to trying to protect against these types of situations, and have automatic updates and have that ability. You know, we've learned in the desktop world how to control this a little bit better, or desktop server world, but in these embedded appliances, I'm not quite sure that we're there. Some are getting better. There's a lot of vendors out there who do have automatic updates, like smart TVs and your DVRs and whatnot. When you pop them up, they'll say, hey, there's a new update, and you can apply it, but I don't know that that's the case with as many of these types of devices as we would hope. So,
Well, these should have some sort of user interface, a screen. I mean, of all
Right.
the devices you could have, luckily this is all about viewing images. So,
right.
hopefully.
Hopefully, users can see that there's a new update and they can apply it when it comes to pass. So instead of the normal weather segment, and you just mentioned Shodan, so we're going to talk about, this is kind of my hybrid weather segment for this week, but I thought it was an interesting discussion to talk about. So you mentioned Shodan. Shodan, as we've talked about before, is a site that kind of, they go out and they scan the internet on various ports and try to enumerate what ports and services are running on any of those services and record who's offering what up. You know, RDP, Telnet, FTP, all these different services that we talk about all the time, and thousands of others. And they have a special section we're going to just kind of touch on. I just want to reference them because I think they have a pretty good page here about industrial control systems and SCADA. SCADA is, actually I don't remember.
Supervisory control and data access, something like that?
Acquisition.
Acquisition.
Yeah, so you're close. But these are systems that are like, they're computers that control different types of automation systems. So, you know, like the air conditioning systems in your office, or other building automation, even elevators, turbines for generators, water treatment plants, power plants, lighting in buildings, all those types of things. Anything you have like an automated system, people have probably tried to invent some way to connect it to the internet. Ultimately, that ends up being an industrial control system of some sort. And actually, most infamously was the Stuxnet virus, right? From a few years back, where they actually wrote a virus specifically targeting the centrifuges that controlled
the PLCs that controlled the centrifuges.
Right, the PLCs, right. Programmable logic controllers that controlled the centrifuges for some nuclear...
Natanz.
Yeah, the Natanz, right. I don't remember all the details. But in any event, that's the kinds of systems we're talking about here. Although that's a very specific one for a specialized thing. But there's lots of those types of systems out there. And I recommend you check out this Shodan page because they actually give you a whole list of all the different ones, like Modbus, Siemens, DNP, Tritium. We've talked about a lot. That's port 1911. I've also noted all the ports and protocols on here for these various ones, which Shodan has as well up on their site. But we're going to take a look at, well, what do we see relative to this in the same way we look at our internet weather? So are we seeing people scanning for this? And if so, to what degree? So that's kind of what I thought would be an interesting thing to look at. Because normally we're looking at more consumer level services and things like that, Telnet, blah, blah, blah. This is specific to these types of industrial control systems. And I suspect that the trend is going to go up because there's more and more of this stuff that's being connected to the internet. We know there's been some security breaches of notable places that have hit the media that were their way in was through these types of industrial control systems, and then they laterally moved to other things inside their network to do more damage. So that's one of the things people should be thinking about. If you recognize any of these types of vendors like BACnet or Omron or PCWorks, et cetera, Heart IP, you should be thinking, oh, wait a second, we've got a system somewhere sitting in the basement that controls our whatever. Is that hooked up to the internet? And if so, what are the protections we have on that? So I would recommend people that watch the program think about that. These are the types of devices you might just deploy and not even know that they're offering these services up. And you just assume, let me just plug it into the internet and just let it go. And they're weird ports, so you might not even know or expect to be looking for activity on these in your network. So just kind of a heads up, some food for thought things to look at if you have some free time in your corporate network and you're looking for things that might present a problem to you in the future. So good areas to try to protect. So this is a list of ports and protocols. And I took this information and I threw it into our normal internet weather charting, so we can kind of see the activity, scanning activity on these various ports and protocols. And there's a lot of them here, right? So I have a whole bunch of different ones, some more than others. I think the 502 TCP, which I think is Modbus, if I remember right, is the light green. Dark green is the 1911 TCP, which is the Tritium Fox. Yellow might be the 102 TCP, which is it's the Siemens S7 protocol. So in any event, we see a lot of activity. What the important thing about this is when I've looked at this before, and we've talked about this on the internet weather, a lot of this is research organizations like Shodan going, scanning the internet, trying to find out who's listening on these, recording that information, but not so much trying to do any kind of active exploitation on them, just trying to get an idea of how many devices out there are listening. You'll see pockets of other colors and bands popping up here on a regular basis, though. And then I said, well, this is just a 60-day view, very recent. And we know that within the past few years, this has kind of been a big area of exploration for people. So I thought it might be more interesting to look at how much scan probe activity we have over the past 2 years. And this, I think, tells a more interesting story because prior to, I would say, maybe January of 2015, there really wasn't a lot of scanning activity on a regular basis. You had little pockets, little blips on the radar back here that were of a much smaller extent. But Modbus, which is an interesting one, I know that there have been some cases of Modbus. There is some active exploit for Modbus, so that's the one in particular that I would be very careful with if you actually have that exposed to the internet, and make sure that you've got proper protections around that. Most of these that we see here, you can see that there's a very regular height to them, which is probably those security organizations or those research organizations like Shodan and some of these other ones doing their regular scanning. While the majority of this activity that we're seeing to the right hand of this chart is probably a lot of researchers doing it for good purposes, there's definitely some people in here doing it for not such good purposes. And that's the thing you want to keep an eye out for. The other interesting thing is I thought is that you could see some changes in some of the trends here. The colors change and the types and what ports and protocols are being scanned for. That profile has changed as of the late part of last year, so right around the November, December timeframe of 2015. You can kind of see a very marked shift in what ports and protocols were getting scanned as regularly, whereas before there was a lot of this dark green. Now there's a bunch of other colors in the mix here. So that could just be a lot of these researchers adding new ones in that they discover that we should be looking for these, but it could be other actors too. The other thing I thought was interesting, so this is all the scan probing activity en masse, and that could be just a small number of research organizations doing that, small number of IPs accounting for a lot of scanning activity, in the 50 to 100 million flows per hour, which is what we see here, even upwards of 275 million at this big spike way here. What's more interesting, and I talk about this a lot in the internet weather, is when you can get a lot of IPs, a lot of source IPs doing things en masse, that's probably more indicative of somebody doing a botnet type of thing as opposed to a research organization. And you can see this is the 2-year chart for that. Unfortunately, the colors didn't stay, although the hot pink or whatever color here is probably still the 502 TCP. It's interesting that you can see the research organizations probably are about 250 scan sources. That's this 0.25. That's where this one kind of levels off here. Anything above that threshold is probably other people involved. And that's where you get up into the 2000s to 2200 source IPs acting per hour. And you can kind of see in the late half of last year, there's been a lot more activity in these ICS SCADA ports as of late. So anything what I in my head is anything above that line is probably other activity from other actors besides research organizations. And the stuff below the line is probably the researchers, because we know how many of those source IPs they have there. So this is, I think it's an interesting kind of just study to look at and maybe give some people food for thought, things that they should look for in their network. You could take that list of chart, ports and protocols, use that in your own reference to see if you see activity on those, maybe scan your own internal networks, try to find out what you have exposed that you don't know about. So these are good things to go look for to make sure that you have proper security controls around them. And that's really all I had for this week. So that's the show for today. Thanks for joining us again. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. You can find the AT&T Threat Track program on the AT&T Tech channel, also on YouTube and iTunes. Please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTSecurity. I'd like to thank you, Jim, for joining us again. Thanks, Matt. I'm John Hogaboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.